Hello, welcome back to our Ancient and Medieval World History video lectures. We're going to talk in this lecture about the Middle East and Africa in the late Middle Ages, basically the period from the 1200s up to about the year 1500, the beginning of the early modern age. This is a period in which we've seen intensified contact between East Asia and the worlds of the Middle East and Eastern Europe. It's a period of globalization more than any preceding period in world history, thanks in part to the development of the Mongol conquests and the intensified international trade that grew up along the Silk Road and along the maritime routes around the coasts of Asia. The connectivity of this period can be exemplified in the experiences of a remarkable world traveler, one of the great travel writers of world history, a Muslim man from Tangiers in North Africa named Abu Abdullah ibn Battuta, who traveled more than 75,000 miles from the 1320s to the 1350s and left a classic narrative of his journeys and the customs, cultures, religious beliefs, food practices of all of the peoples that he encountered. Ibn Battuta and his journals are a remarkable sign of a changing world in the late Middle Ages. A man from one region of the world in the early Middle Ages would have really been confined to the social networks and political contacts of that particular region. But Ibn Battuta is part of a broader network, both a religious one within the Islamic world, but also a network of merchants and travelers that stretches across much of the Mediterranean region and the African and Asian and parts of the European continent. Among the many places that Ibn Battuta visited and wrote about are three great powers of the Muslim world in the late Middle Ages. And looking at them is a good way to segue from the political history of Eastern Asia back to Western Asia and Africa, and to think about some of the new powers that are rising in this part of the world in the late Middle Ages and as the world moves towards what we think of as early modernity. These three kingdoms that we're going to focus on in today's lecture are all on the rise from the 1200s through the 1300s. These are the kingdoms of Mali in West Africa, of Mamluk Egypt, centered around the great city of Cairo in the Nile Valley, but ruling an empire across the western half of the Middle East. And finally, a new power within the Middle Eastern world, the power of the Turks. We've seen different Turkish groups building kingdoms at a number of periods throughout medieval history. The Seljuk Turks in the early Middle Ages had tried to conquer the Middle East and had helped to spark the Crusades in response to their expansion. But in the 1300s, there's a new Turkish group called the Ottoman Turks, and they're going to build one of the key lasting empires that's going to stretch from the Middle Ages into the modern world, all the way up to the 20th century. So we're going to think about these empires in turn. And again, we want to think about some of their leaders and their contacts with the rest of the world, and what are some of the outcomes of their imperial experience. Now, first of all, we can think about the rise of Islamic empires in Western Africa. We know that Islam had spread from its Mediterranean bases across the Atlas Mountains and the Sahara Desert over the course of the early Middle Ages. Certainly by the 700s and the early 800s CE, Muslim travelers and merchants are moving beyond the coastal areas of the Arab empires in the Mediterranean and reaching down through international trade routes to make contact with sub-Saharan civilizations. Along the eastern coastline of Africa, there's extensive development in the early Middle Ages. There's a whole network of Swahili city-states that develops a robust trade with the Arab world early in the Middle Ages. There's also a large kingdom in Ethiopia, which becomes a Christian kingdom at war with local Muslim sultanates during the period of the Crusades. In Western Africa, there are a succession of early states that rose and fell. Kingdoms such as Ghana managed to control trade routes and trade various goods from salt to gold to horses with Arab merchants who are coming down from North Africa and making contact. But the largest of the sub-Saharan African empires was the Empire of Mali, which began with the rule of a king named Sundiata in the 1230s CE. Mali would be a great African empire that would expand very quickly and then dominate trade routes across western parts of Central Africa from the 1200s into the early 1400s. Sundiata himself was a charismatic military leader. We have some evidence that suggests he's able to unify a number of tribes under the leadership of his own Malinke clan, which gives its name to the Mali kingdom. And he may have introduced mounted warfare, bringing in larger numbers of horses and using cavalry in his victory against local opponents. Later, oral traditions grow up and make Sundiata into an epic figure. Much of what's actually written about him is written down many centuries later after oral traditions that turn him into a sort of sorcerer monarch, a powerful wizard who uses great magic to overwhelm his opponents. He himself is certainly a real figure, although the later traditions that grow up around his memory contain a great deal of the supernatural, attributing his victory over his main opponent, a king named Sumanguru, to a sort of wizard's duel in which Sundiata found the secret of his success in fashioning a special weapon made from the bones of an albino rooster, which was able to overcome the magic of his opponent. What we know about the historical Sundiata is somewhat limited, but we know that as well as defeating neighboring tribal leaders, winning some key battles to put together his kingdom in the 1230s, we know that he also converted to Islam. And he seems to have been instrumental in not only exploiting long-distance trade with Muslim merchants from North Africa, but also in starting to build significant cities in Mali and building both mosques and madrasas, schools for the teaching of Islamic law within his kingdom. Now, Sundiata oversaw a kingdom of Mali that stretched for more than 1,000 miles from west to east. It stretches to the Atlantic coast of West Africa. In the other direction, it incorporates most of the Niger River Valley. And Mali is particularly wealthy through its overland trade with other African states in gold and in salt and in horses. Now, Sundiata's dynasty lasts for several more Malian kings, or mansas, which is the local term for king. In the early 1300s, the Kingdom of Mali expands its contacts with the Mediterranean world and Middle Eastern powers. And in particular, there's a great gesture of diplomatic and economic power that's made by a king of Mali named Mansa Musa in 1324. In that year, this king of Mali, probably the grandson of Sundiata, announces that he intends to go on pilgrimage to show his devotion to Islam. He is going to make the Hajj, the journey to Mecca. And he's going to do this by following a caravan road across Central Africa and then north to Egypt, to the Nile River Valley. He negotiates with The Sultan of Egypt, the ruler of the Mamluk dynasty, gets permission to travel in state with a massive entourage. This is sort of a peaceful diplomatic invasion, if you will. The kingdoms of Mali and Egypt are at peace with one another. But the king of Mali, to show off Mali's greatness, travels with an entourage of 15,000 men and women, bringing enormous amounts of gold and other trade goods with them for the journey. They pass through the Kingdom of Egypt, they visit the Sultan of Egypt in Cairo, then they travel across to Arabia and pay their respects at Mecca. This is a way of showing Mali's arrival on the world stage, showing off the idea that Mali is a great power, to be treated as an equal to the older powers of the Muslim world. Mali gets the attention not only of other Muslim neighbors, such as the Kingdom of Egypt, but also gets the attention of European powers in this same period that are becoming more aware of the world at greater distances from Europe and opportunities for trade and exploration and economic exploitation. Now, the tragedy of Mali's history is the timing of the Mali Empire's collapse. It was robust in controlling the economy and society of Western Africa for 2 centuries. But in the early 1400s, the Mali dynasty finally collapsed in a series of civil wars among its ruling members. By the 1430s, the Mali Empire is fragmenting into a number of separate West African kingdoms, fighting against one another for wealth and prestige, and willing to use external allies to try to get the advantage over their local opponents. This timing is tragic because it coincides with the beginning of European exploration by the Kingdom of Portugal in northern Africa and then down the West African coast. And at precisely the moment when the Portuguese Empire starts to emerge as a trading power and a threat to the security of local African regions, the Mali Empire, which is at its height might have been able to defend Western Africa, is in a state of collapse. And the Portuguese show up at this moment when Mali is becoming a failed state, and this provides the backstory for the beginnings of the Portuguese slave trade in Africa, which expands into the wider European slave trade of the early modern period. Now, the second major Islamic power that we want to think about in the late Middle Ages is the power of Egypt, the Mamluk kingdom of Egypt from the 1200s to the early 1500s. The Mamluk kingdom is a successor state. It's ruled by a successor dynasty that comes to power after the collapse of Saladin's dynasty in the early 1200s. We've talked about the dynasty of Saladin, the charismatic Muslim leader who united Muslim powers to retake Jerusalem from the Crusaders in the late 1100s. Saladin left behind a legacy of successful religious warfare, led by Egypt against the European settlers who had come with the Crusades to the Middle East. By the early 1200s, the tide has turned massively in Egypt's favor. A number of later crusades, such as the Fifth and Sixth Crusades, attempted to invade Egypt in order to dislodge their opponents from the Holy Land, but Egypt's sultans were able to defend their territories and repel Crusader invasions, and Jerusalem remained in Egypt's hands. Now, in the course of these wars against the Crusader states, as they take back more and more castles and start to incorporate the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean coastline, into Egypt's empire, the Ayyubid sultans required military manpower. They needed soldiers that could serve them, and they found that it was not effective drafting Egyptian peasants into their armies as soldiers. They needed the peasants working in Egypt in large numbers to keep up its food supply and keep up its own economic prosperity. And so increasingly, the armies of Saladin's successors recruit very heavily from a base of slave soldiers. Essentially, they, rather than drafting their own people, they buy slaves on the international market. They import the slaves into Egypt as children, and then they train them as warriors throughout their childhood and teens in order to turn them into a military elite of the Egyptian army. These slave soldiers typically come from Christian areas of the Black Sea region in particular, especially from parts of the Caucasus and Ukraine and parts of southern Russia. Basically, there's an international slave trade market that is developing when the Mongols come into the region in the 1230s and 1240s. They take over these trade routes and they sell prisoners of war on the slave market. And so you will have large numbers of children who are taken from their villages, who are brought down to trading ports, and then they are shipped off and they're bought and sold by merchants from across the Mediterranean world. It's not only Egyptians in this period, you also have some of the merchants of the remaining Crusader states. You have some Byzantine Greeks. You have a number of merchant cities in Italy, such as Venice, that become heavily involved in this trade. So Egypt would buy large numbers of these enslaved children. For them, it was convenient to buy them from this particular region because Islamic law forbids the enslaving of other Muslims. So the typical practice was to buy Christian slaves as children, bring them back to Egypt, and again, give them this childhood of intensive military training and preparation. They arm them, they train them to ride, they train them in archery and swordsmanship, and turn them into adept warriors. And once they reach adulthood, these slaves are given the opportunity to convert officially to Islam, in exchange for which they will be given their freedom. They will also be given farms and peasants who are ordered to work on those farms. They basically allow them, the former slaves, to continue training as soldiers. And they become the counterpart to Europe's knights. They become the elite mounted soldiers of Egypt's army. These former slave soldiers are known as Mamluks. And Mamluk soldiers contribute the most important warriors in the Egyptian armies that recapture Crusader castles during the early 1200s. By the middle of the 1200s, the Mamluks are present in Egyptian armies at every level. Not only do you have Mamluk soldiers as the rank and file, but the most talented ones have been appointed generals. And finally, a number of these Mamluk generals band together. They actually overthrow the political successors of Saladin, and they start a new royal dynasty in Cairo, Egypt, called the Mamluk dynasty. Some of these former Christian slaves who have now completely converted and accepted Islam start this new royal family. And the Mamluks rule Egypt from the middle of the 1200s into the early 1500s. Now, the Mamluks in Egypt are most successful in completing Egypt's great victory over the Crusader states. But they also win a remarkable success in the middle of the 1200s in defeating the Mongols, who have come down through Persia and Iraq, trying to ally with local crusaders and trying to seize this part of the Muslim world for themselves. In the year 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, an Egyptian Mamluk general named Baibars manages to defeat and kill a local Mongol leader. He stops a Mongol invasion of the Levant. This basically stops Mongol expansion into the Middle East from going any further. And the Mamluk general who won that battle, a general named Baibars, then goes back to Egypt, assassinates the reigning Mamluk Sultan Qutuz, and takes his place on the throne. Baibars is the most successful of the Mamluk warrior leaders. He goes on just a few years later to capture the last great crusader fortress in the Levant, the great French castle of the Croix des Chevaliers in what's now Syria. And eventually, in the 1290s, the Mamluk dynasty completes the takeover of the very last crusader bases, ending the period of the Crusades in the Middle East. Now, in the wake of this triumph, the Mamluks not only rule Egypt itself, but they also control the whole eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, and they also expand into Arabia, where they come to control the great Islamic religious centers of Medina and Mecca. Cairo itself, the capital of the Mamluk Empire, becomes a great hub for international trade. All roads lead to Cairo. By the early 1300s, Cairo is the largest city in the world, and its trade routes connect it with the Mongol empires to the east, with Mali in West Africa, with the remnants of the Byzantine Empire in the Balkans, and the Italian and other Christian trading centers of the Mediterranean world. However, this period of Mamluk Egyptian wealth and prosperity lasts only a few decades before Egypt suffers a catastrophe of unprecedented human scale. The Mamluk Empire is briefly the center of the Islamic world, but its central position on the trade routes of the early 1300s, the same routes that allow someone like Ibn Battuta to travel between cultures and encounter peoples all over the world. These routes also in the middle of the 1300s become paths for the transmission of pandemic disease. The most famous pandemic in world history, the consequences of which are especially apparent to us here in this pandemic of our own age. The most famous pandemic of world history is, of course, the Great Bubonic Plague, or Black Death epidemic of the 14th century, estimated to have killed between a quarter and a third of the populations of Asia and Northern Africa and Europe. Now, the majority of the familiar written sources about the Great Black Death epidemic stem from Europe. Popular culture tends to view the Black Death as a European phenomenon, but it has an equally or greater or an equal or greater impact on the Middle East, and especially on the empire of Mamluk Egypt. In the year 1347, the bubonic plague travels from Silk Road trade routes to southern Russia and Ukraine and the Crimea. It's picked up on merchant ships, probably both from Italy and from Egypt, and it seems to make landfall both in southern Europe and in Egypt at approximately the same time in late in that year. The impact on the city of Cairo and the other large cities of the Egyptian Empire is devastating. Ibn Battuta happens to be in Damascus, Syria at the time in one of his journeys, and he leaves behind a harrowing eyewitness account of the impact of the bubonic plague on these massive trade centers, urban centers of the Mamluk world. Supposedly, thousands of people are dying every day on the streets of Cairo and Damascus and other cities. Ibn Battuta describes a panicked social response to this plague that is as poignant as it is tragic. Here we are in Mamluk Egypt, a state that has grown rich and powerful in the context of religious warfare between the Muslim world and the Christian Crusader settlers. Yet here in the wake of the Crusades, Ibn Battuta describes a mass religious response to this epidemic. Christians and Muslims and Jews alike can agree that this unprecedented horror is a sign of the wrath of God. And the governors of Damascus and other great cities call for public fasting, public prayer, and for unity between the different religious groups in trying to avert God's anger. Ibn Battuta himself, who miraculously escapes infection, describes seeing a great crowd of Muslims, Jews, and Christians who came all together in a mass public gathering in Damascus. They pray and they march to synagogues, to churches, and finally all together they crowd into the city's greatest mosque and pray for God's deliverance from this horror. And of course the great tragedy of this is all too familiar to us in our own day. The massing of people here in an effort at religious unity and saving them from this disease only exposes them to mass infection and probably increases the death toll in Damascus and many other cities. So ultimately, the Great Bubonic Plague of the mid-1300s devastated the great cities and trade centers of the Mamluk Empire. The empire didn't fall, but it loses a large percentage of its population. It is then exposed to attack from other powers that have not been as badly affected by the plague over the century to come. Eventually, the Mamluk Empire would lose some of its Middle Eastern territories to attacks by the late Mongol successor state of Timur from Central Asia in the late 1300s. And in the 1400s, it would come under attack from the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks were based in rural districts of Turkey during the 1300s, especially in mountainous regions that were less urbanized and therefore were less exposed to the ravages of the bubonic plague. They seem to have escaped from the scale of disaster that was faced by their neighbors in Mamluk Egypt. In the later 1300s, the Ottoman Turks began to expand in the aftermath of the Great Plague. They spread from Turkey across the straits into Greece and the Balkans, which they conquer in the late 1300s. By the 1400s, a powerful Ottoman Turkish kingdom straddles both Western Turkey and Greece and the Balkans, and it moves in on what's left of the Byzantine Empire at Constantinople. The major assault came in the year 1453. Constantinople, the last Byzantine holdout, is assaulted by a massive Turkish army led by the Sultan Mehmet II. The Turkish army, like the Mamluk Egyptian army, relies heavily on slave soldier recruits who are trained and turned into military elites. In Turkey, they're known as the Janissaries. The Janissaries provide the rank and file, elite fighting soldiers who make up the infantry of the Turkish army. They also have excellent horse soldiers, the Spahis. But the biggest addition to Turkish military power by the early 1400s is their ability to take advantage of a new invention, the invention of cannon, which began to transform battle and siege at the end of the Middle Ages. Mehmet II brings not only a large Turkish army, but also enormous cannons, which he uses to smash holes in the walls of Constantinople. And eventually, after massive losses and a heroic defense by the last Byzantine military leaders, the Turks break through in 1453. They capture Constantinople and kill the last Byzantine emperor. And they rename the city Istanbul. It becomes the center of the Turkish Empire under the Turkish Sultan Mehmet II. In the wake of their victory over the Byzantines, the Ottoman Turks would continue to expand in multiple directions. Sultan Mehmet II set up an ideology of world rule. He claimed to be the Sultan of the Turks, but also claimed the Byzantine royal title of Caesar, the title that went all the way back to the Roman Empire. He claimed to be both Sultan and Caesar, a ruler of all the peoples of the world who could unite the earth under the benevolent rule of the Ottoman dynasty. He allowed freedom of religion within his empire. Jews and Christians were allowed to continue in their faith as peoples of the book. They could have churches and synagogues and continue as long as they pay taxes to the Ottoman Turkish authorities. The Turkish armies continue to sweep from the Balkans further into southeastern Europe, pressing into the Danube River Valley. In the Middle East, by the early 1500s, the Ottoman Turks are ready to conquer Mamluk Egypt. They attack the Mamluks, they defeat their armies, again bringing cannons to bear, which the Egyptians do not have in similar numbers. They capture Egypt itself and Cairo in the early 1500s, and then also press down and capture Mecca and Medina in Arabia. So they make this bid for leadership both over the Islamic faith and over the larger world. But they face rival kingdoms and empires that are not willing to let that leadership claim go uncontested. In the Middle East, they will find their strongest opposition to their east in Persia, where Mongol power has fallen, but by the early 1500s, a new Persian royal family practicing Shiite Islam will emerge and will set up a Persian Shiite kingdom as the rival of the Sunni Ottoman Turks. To the west, in the Mediterranean and in southeastern Europe, as the Turks try to expand their claim to a universal empire, they will face fierce resistance from the Holy Roman Empire of Germany and the rising European power of Spain.